long as you're honest, and as long as you're giving a version or a brand narrative that makes sense to your audience and is truthful and you can back up with hard evidence, Google will repeat whatever you ask it to say. My personal point of view is brand drives marketing. Marketing is what drives SEO. Brand marketing, SEO, you have to focus on brand. You start there. And if you're not doing that, you're missing out on a huge, huge part of your business.
Yeah. So we're very fortunate for today's show. We have Jason Barnard on the show, and he's a brand search expert. So Jason, good to meet you.
Absolutely lovely to be here. Thank you so much. I'm delighted, and I can see the Google shirt in the background with the very old logo.
That is a very old logo. So that is actually a hockey jersey. So when I joined Google, this was in 2002. One of the things about Google that was like quirky and unique was they would all play roller hockey in the parking lot. And that was like their stress relief from developing this amazing search engine.
Right.
So I had joined as sort of a temp to hire. So I was reviewing ads. And every Tuesday and Thursday at like 4 o'clock, I would just take off way before I was supposed to. And my managers looked at me. They were like, "What are you doing?" I was like, "Well, I'm going to go play hockey." And like, "Well, you can't do that." And I was like, but Sergey's there. Sergey's there. So like, they're like, "Okay, fine. Then you're going to play hockey with Sergey." So yeah, but that was a great way for me to get to know people on the team. And I also scored a cool hockey jersey from that.
That's wonderful. And when you were playing hockey, I was being a blue dog in a cartoon, making money from Google ads or Google AdSense.
Okay, well, yeah. So AdSense. So I guess you were arbitraging.
Well, we were really early on in AdSense, and we added the ads to our website, and it was a website for children. We generated 1 billion page views in 2007. And as you can imagine, at 1 billion page views, 2007 running AdSense, plus a subscription service. If you didn't want AdSense on your the games that your children were playing, you could pay a subscription and remove the ads. And we were doing very, very, very well with 1 billion page views a year.
And let's talk about branded search, right? So besides your early days of AdSense, splitting your time between 2 countries, being an amazing chef, branded search is kind of your thing nowadays. So talk more about that.
Yeah, well, after the Blue Dog and Yellow Koala cartoon website stopped for business reasons, and that's the horrible thing about life, is sometimes some of the funnest, most delightful endeavors fall to evil business profitability. And I then moved on to a new career in digital marketing and struggled to get clients because prospects would Google my name, Jason Barnard, and Google would say right at the top, Jason Barnard is a cartoon blue dog called Boo-Wah. And then the prospect would say, well, my digital marketing strategy is really important to my business. I'm not going to give it to a blue dog.
Mm-hmm.
So the step that I took next was I want to educate Google so it understands who I am and how I want to be represented. So I learned to educate and guide Google to repeat my brand narrative the way I wanted when people were searching my name. And I've built an entire career over the last 10 years and an agency called Calicube and a platform called Calicube Pro, all designed to manage brand on search.
That's amazing. So many companies and people struggle with this, right? So you might have a name that's fairly common and you Google it, you find the wrong person. So how do you get Google? And I don't want to say how do you manipulate, but how do you teach Google like what your brand narrative is?
Right. It's a great question, and not saying manipulate is very difficult.
But we don't want to manipulate because it's usually not like what leads to long-term success, right? We want to put like amazing content out there,
yeah,
and then make sure that it also gets found. So there's sort of, and I'll let you weigh in, of course, because you're the expert. But there's 2 angles, right? It's about producing the great content, and that should be done for people. But then you also want to do the technical things to make sure that the search engines actually know what to do with it and know when to show it.
Right, 100%. I mean, manipulate is the wrong word, as you say, because manipulate suggests that we're telling lies. And as long as you're honest, And as long as you're giving a version or a brand narrative that makes sense to your audience and is truthful and you can back up with hard evidence, Google will repeat whatever you ask it to say. All you have to do is understand how it thinks so that you can educate it and guide it. And that's what my work is all about. So you have to identify first exactly what you want to represent. And that's a huge problem that people don't think about. The first session we have with our clients is always, what are you talking about? What are you trying to say? And to whom are you trying to say it? And that's a huge problem for most companies and most people. So we get through that, we identify what they're trying to say, and then we analyze using CaliCube Pro their entire digital ecosystem. And we pull out prioritize.
So sorry, can you pause on that for a second? So I'm really fascinated by the fact that many companies don't know, I guess, what they stand for or what it is they're trying to say. So share an example, if you can, like, because I think most companies would argue that they do know, but maybe they don't know at the level that you're thinking.
Okay. Oh, it's a great question because I skipped over one part. Is the first thing is identify what entities we're talking about. And an entity is a thing you can name. And you're an entity, I'm an entity, CaliCube is an entity. CaliCube Pro is an entity. CaliCube Tuesdays is an entity, and Branded Search and Beyond is an entity. So I'll tell you what all those things are. Jason Barnard, me, entity, person. CaliCube, entity, corporation. CaliCube on Google Maps is an entity, CaliCube head office. It's not the same thing as a company. It's the head office of the company. It's a location in Google Maps.
Yeah.
CaliCube Pro is an entity. It's a SaaS platform. So it's distinct from CaliCube and the CaliCube head office. CaliCube Tuesdays is an event series that happens on YouTube. And then Branded Search and Beyond is a podcast series hosted by the entity Jason Barnard, and we've just gone full circle. Okay. So identifying the entities is the first point, and there are a surprising number of entities. And then the company says, well, we've got the brand messaging for the company. We've got the phrases that we always say, and we've got our catch line, and the CEO generally doesn't. So we say, well, let's create the brand narrative for the CEO. Let's make that clear. Let's then also look at what your catchphrase and your brand message from your company is and see if it is in fact consistent across the web. And believe me, it never is. And then we're going to identify what the description and the catchphrase and the brand narrative of CaliCube Pro, CaliCube Tuesdays, Branded Search and Beyond, they all need to be defined. And then I'll let you come back in. Each of them will need to mention the other entities, and they need to mention those other entities consistently. So CaliCube will mention CaliCube Tuesdays and CaliCube Pro, and they need to mention them and describe them in the same way that CaliCube Pro and CaliCube Tuesdays describe themselves.
Yeah. So yeah, you really do need to go back to the start, because if each of these entities has sort of a disjointed messaging and brand positioning, then once they start mentioning or cross-linking, then someone as a human who's sort of following that path is going to get confused. So when I think about that personally, from the optimizer perspective, being in such a dynamic market that's so driven by all the changes that Google's making, we have to update our positioning relatively frequently, right? Like a couple of years ago, it was about how does optimizer fit in a world where you can do a lot of automated bidding by Google. And then it became like, okay, what does optimizer do when there's performance max campaigns, right? And so the underlying narrative has always been about helping PPC managers be more effective with their time so that they can still have a life on the weekends. And the narrative changes over time. So the events that we do, all of these things, right? So what's the strategy to get everything in line?
It's a brilliant question because most people don't think of that. Your brand narrative necessarily changes over time as you understand your audience better, as your company evolves. You also mentioned that Google's algorithms change and your audience and their perception and their expectations might change. So you might need to update your brand narrative and your brand messaging. So it's an ongoing job, because something you said 5 years ago is not necessarily what you're saying today. And if you don't know where you said it, you don't know where to correct it.
Mm-hmm.
So what we do with CaliQ Pro, it's designed to maintain an ongoing list of all of the resources that are talking about you or where you're talking about yourself that Google is paying attention to. And what Google is paying attention to is what your audience is paying attention to. So therefore, every time you need to update, which I would suggest is probably once a year, maybe once every 2 years, depending on how stable your business is, you can then go into CaliQ Pro. This is what we do for our clients. And we just go through the list and we update everything all at the same time. And that's the trick. You said, how do you avoid disjointedness? Is that within a day, we can update your entire digital ecosystem. And that means not only does Google get a very consistent message, i.e., the old message changes to the new message across everything within a day, but your audience, as they come down the funnel, are seeing an incredibly consistent message as well, which is great for conversions. So the trick is not only to build a consistent digital ecosystem with a consistent brand narrative that refers to each of the entities within your company ecosystem in the same manner between each other, but you maintain it also over time to make sure that every new mention, every new brand, how can we put it? Every time you shapeshift or change slightly your brand narrative, or Google's algorithms change, you're always on top of it. And as my personal point of view is, brand drives marketing. Marketing is what drives SEO. Brand marketing, SEO. You have to focus on brand. You start there, and if you're not doing that, you're missing out on a huge, huge part of your business.
Yeah. Well, and then I want to unpack that statement a little bit as well. But going back first to CaliQ, right? So because I think one of the challenges is that we all control our website. So that's the easy thing. We know to go and fix that. But then, I'm an author for different blogs. So I've got author blurbs. They have some sort of brand positioning in that. I've done YouTube videos for many, many years. Those videos will have some sort of brand positioning. That's a little bit the older one. So obviously, I think the author bios, yes, you update those because people look at them. When it comes to stuff like what's been on YouTube or older blog posts that you've put out, you can have a reference to that to say, like, listen, this is outdated, but would you recommend taking that offline? Would you recommend editing that? Because to me, it would almost feel like it's okay for people to be able to see what was the evolution of the brand narrative. Okay.
Well, yeah, the evolution of the brand narrative is definitely something you can leave, but you have to remember that if somebody's coming outside without any context, that can be confusing. Google is going to find it confusing, so you need to be careful about that. You need to make a human judgment, which is something algorithms aren't able to do. And we have an algorithm that will tell you what you may want to correct, but it won't tell you have to correct everything, because you need that human judgment of what is my history, how much of my history should remain, how much should I correct it, how much should I delete it, and how much should I leave it, but then refer to the fact that things have changed since then. So maintaining the list of the resources that you need to maintain and prioritizing that list, because what's surprising is that the priorities will change over time. So today, LinkedIn might be the most important profile page for you, but in a year's time, that might be Instagram. I'm making this up. Yeah. And you don't know, but our data will tell you. So you know that you're doing it in the right order. And the other thing that we found is when you get all of this together in one list and you can see all of the resources that are referring to you and you know how they're talking about you or you're talking about yourself, you can make a global judgment just by looking through the list on CaliQ Pro and say, well, this one needs to be changed, but within the context of my entire digital ecosystem that I can see at a glance on CaliQ Pro, I can safely leave this one.
Yeah, okay, that's awesome. So, I mean, and we've talked a little bit about the tactics, I think, by talking about the software. So if you don't know what's out there, then obviously you're going to struggle to get everything updated. So that's where tactically these lists are very helpful, and the software I see could add a lot of value. But let's go to the other statement that I wanted to unpack, which is maybe more at the strategy level. So you said brand drives marketing, marketing drives
SEO.
SEO. Okay. So yeah, to talk about that first step, how does brand drive marketing? What did you mean by that?
Right, lovely question. Because if you don't have a brand, you've got nothing to market. So having a brand and a clear brand message with a clear audience that you're aiming at, you can then start creating your marketing materials. And those marketing materials need to address a problem or a pain point that the audience has and solve it, or indicate that you have the solution for them. Those marketing materials need to be placed so that you're standing where the audience is looking, and they're not looking at your website if they don't know who you are. So we're immediately away from the website. We're on LinkedIn, we're on podcasts, we're on YouTube, we're on media sites. All of these are legitimate strategies to be standing where the audience. Oh, Quora is another great example. And so you create the marketing materials to represent the brand and the offers as a solution to the problem that the user is having. You place them where the audience is looking. The marketing materials indicate to the audience that you have the solution to their problem or their pain point, and invite them down the funnel, which is to your website, to convert.
Right.
When you do that, you are demonstrating across your entire digital ecosystem that you are the best solution to the audience. And Google is watching over your shoulder all the time because it's crawling all these pages. So in SEO, people focus on their website. We focus on the entire digital ecosystem. And we found with the CaliQ process, which I invented, that what we can do is identify these places where you can stand where the audience is looking, show them you have the solution, invite them down the funnel, get engagement from those users with the marketing materials. As you're doing that, you repackage the marketing materials for Google, either on the platforms themselves or on your website. Google will then, as you said earlier on, you need to make the technical changes and the structural changes to the content so that Google can find and digest it. If it can do that, over a year, what it will see is that you are serving the subset of its users, who are your audience, incredibly well across the entire internet. And it will understand that you are the best solution that it can offer to the subset of its users, who are your audience. So it joins the dots, and you become the best representation in your market of the solution that Google is looking for to give to its users.
And another interesting thing you said was Google can only repeat what you said, right?
Yes.
So you can't go on the assumption that Google will figure it out. And that's the beauty, right? That's the beauty of SEO. It's the beauty of PPC, is that we craft the message.
Yes.
And ultimately, we lead people to that message, but it is that message that gets repeated. Now, the one little twist here that people might argue is, well, hey, generative AI is really coming into the mix. And so now you could assume there's a world where you do a brand search for Jason Barnard. And so Google is like, okay, well, there's the YouTube channel, there's the website, there's these products, et cetera, et cetera. So now it does a generative rehashing of everything it's found on these top 10 results for your name. What comes out of that? It's generative, right? What's your take on that? Is it still repeating the message, or do we have to be more careful with generative search results?
You have to be much more careful. You have to be much more proactive. And we divide the SERP into three parts at CaliQ. On the right-hand side on desktop, you have a knowledge panel or a Google business profile. That's knowledge, that's facts. On the left-hand side, you have the traditional results, the blue links, the videos, the Twitter boxes, the people also ask. That's recommendations. On the right-hand side, facts. On the left-hand side, recommendations. The generative AI is simply Google's assessment of the facts and the recommendations that it's already found. So if you can control the facts and the recommendations, which is what the CaliQ process does, you will control the generative AI. Since the generative AI is not inventing anything new, it's assimilating a large amount of information and presenting its assessment of that information. So that means you need to understand that the control of the holistic overview, which, as I said earlier on, the CaliQ Pro interface you can see, is key.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important point, that I think a lot of people do know it, but it's worth reiterating, is generative AI in search is not inventing new things. It is not bringing in the 1000th result on organic and all of a sudden saying like, oh, that's the one that we should really focus on. What it seems to be doing is it's taking the top organic results and the top facts and the top ads and rehashing those in a summarization, right?
Yeah.
And so it's still important. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, and with generative AI, they're inserting the ads inside the generative AI. They're still figuring out exactly how to do it. But what's interesting is even within the generative AI, you can see what the facts are. You can see what the recommendations are. And you can see when Google's sneaking in the ads as part of its business strategy because it needs that.
Yeah,
It's
it's very clear when
advertising
they're
platform.
ads. But I think it also goes to one of your core points, which is like you have to be consistent across all the places where you're found. Because like in the old days, it would mean if you had inconsistent messaging, while your YouTube video might say one thing, and on that same search results page, there's your brand homepage and it says a different thing. And then there's also a link to the Wikipedia and here's the founder and this is what they stand for, right? So as a human, you kind of process these things. But now in the new world, the generative AI section that's at the top is trying to make sense of these three disjointed messages and spitting something out. And the more it's consistent, the easier time the Gen AI is going to have to say like, oh, well, here's what they said. Like, I don't have to make stuff up because it's consistent between the three. But if you're like, it's A, B, and C, and now you ask Gen AI, like, how does that fit together? Maybe it's going to start making some stuff up and making some assumptions of how you got from A to B and then to C. So I think what all the things that you're advocating for are clearly even more important as these machines try to make sense of it all.
Right. Yeah, and I love the way you've just explained that because it's I always hear my own explanations over and over and over again, and you've just explained exactly the same thing in an incredibly more clear manner. And what's lovely is I built CaliCube Pro 8 years ago, and I haven't changed it for 8 years. Well, I've obviously been updating it, and I've been making it more performant. We've got 1 billion data points now. It's a huge, huge, huge machine. But the essential foundation of CaliCube Pro existed 8 years ago, and Google has just caught up with me.
So what does that mean for the next 8 years, Jason?
Well, that's the mantra in our company at CaliCube. We're 8 years ahead. We're going to stay 8 years ahead. So in 8 years, we're going to be 16 years ahead, and so on and so forth. So our aim, and it's probably unrealistic, but if you don't have ambitious aims, you're not going to get anywhere, in my opinion. And so we're organizing the team to make sure that we're constantly keeping ahead. And I've learned recently that I have to stop talking about what I'm learning for the next 8 years. I need to talk about the things that apply today. And I'm not very good at it.
Well, I think as founders, it's you obviously want to be thinking about 8 years into the future. And like, honestly, I can't think 8 years in the future because in at least paid search, it feels too fast. And quite honestly, asked me 2 years ago, would AI be writing fantastic ads? Would it be writing full blog posts? I would have said no, unequivocally, no, that's not going to happen. And then ChatGPT comes out and it's like mind blown, everything that it can do, right? So if I'm good at figuring out 2-3 years down the road what my company needs to focus on to be relevant, then I think I've done a pretty good job. But you're right, you have to take that future vision and you have to bring it back to like what matters to people today.
Sorry, you just made me think of something really interesting because Hummingbird was 2015. That's when I built CaliCube Pro. So I built CaliCube Pro on the assumption that Hummingbird was a thing, and it hasn't been fully implemented. It's been kind of growing into the system, and generative AI is making Hummingbird a huge, huge, huge deal, but 8 years late. And I was talking to Fabrice Canal.
To back up for a second, right? Because Google is actually talking about how there's no more hummingbirds and pandas and everything because people get confused by these names if they weren't around in 2015 doing it. So to talk a little bit more about what Hummingbird is and how it fits into Gen AI today.
Hummingbird is all about Google understanding the world much like a human, and their ambition was to understand the entire world in a human, quasi-human manner, i.e. understanding who we are, how we're connected, and what we're doing. rather than just counting words and counting links, which is what it traditionally did. So we all thought Google was really smart back in 2002. And now you say, well, all it did was count words and count links. It suddenly seems very stupid. And Hummingbird took it to the next level, saying we're going to understand the world. And so we're now, with generative AI, coming to a point where that understanding that it's been building over the last 8 years really means something, because with their assessment, they're doing fact checking. And with their assessment, they're looking into the corpus of texts that they've accumulated over the years to train the machine not to understand the world because it doesn't truly understand the world, but to be able to replicate the world. Does that make sense? Was that clear, or am I?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, I mean, so if you look at artificial intelligence and sort of the different methods people have tried over the years to get it to be quote unquote intelligent, it used to be about feeding it facts, right? So to say Frederick Valles was born in Belgium, Frederick Valles was born in this year, and like you keep feeding it these facts, and over time it can like build sort of connections between things, and it starts to quote unquote understand the world. But what scientists found was like there's just so many things and so much nuance that you can't understand because of this. And so it'd be like, what would be a good example? Like if you understand that an airplane flies in the air, if you feed that as a fact, then the artificial intelligence might argue with you that an airplane never drives on the ground, and be confused about how does the airplane get to the point on the runway where it takes off from. So the level of detail that you need to feed in this fact system is to the degree that it's never possible. There's so many edge cases and so many little nuances that we have to teach.
Yep.
And then it got into, I think, Hummingbird and maybe more of a semantic search world, and the semantic web and understanding connections between things. And what's really fascinating about that is it's really taking facts and words and turning them into mathematical representations. And so one thing I'm fascinated by nowadays is when you do these vectors, and vectors basically drive semantic search. A vector is a mathematical representation in many dimensions, in a multidimensional space, about what a word means. And so one example that I like to give is if you go to Google and you say, give me a great recipe for Valentine's Day, or themed for Valentine's Day. Google semantically can understand that Valentine's Day kind of has an association with the color red, and it has an association with the words love, right? Because this has been encoded in the vector space. Like, you know, what's the redness of Valentine's Day? And so it can find that, and then it can say, well, okay, if we're looking for something related to that, why don't we come up with a recipe with some red ingredients?
Yeah.
So let's say apples, strawberries, because they also have a redness factor within them. And so that's why you can do a search for something like Valentine's Day recipes, and you can get results with apples and strawberries, which logically makes sense to us. But it all comes out of that mathematical representation. And so the really fascinating thing to me is how deep do you encode the world? Like if you look at OpenAI, they go about 1,000 dimensions in that vector space. What would happen if we went 10,000 dimensions in that vector space? So these are questions that fascinate me, and I'm not a scientist or an AI developer. But yeah.
But sorry, there are two things that strike me there. Is number one, literally this afternoon, there was a whole conversation on Twitter where somebody was explaining what you were explaining and saying you can't say that Google understands the world. You can't say that it understands that X person, Y person, this wrote this, and so on and so forth, because it's mathematical representations within a vectorial space. And there's a huge question there. You can explain that all day long, but what we're trying to do is educate people who have no idea what we're talking about. So you're a marketer. Let's just say Google understands the world, and your role is to educate Google about your particular little corner of the world. How you're doing it within the vector space in Google's algorithms doesn't matter to the marketer. What does matter is the result of the work is that Google appears to understand. So you might as well just say Google understands. I'm taking that stance of saying, let's make it accessible. I'm not criticizing you. I'm saying that we need to make it accessible to marketers, or we're going to shut them out. And the vectorial space, mathematical relationships, and so on and so forth, is going to switch 99% of the world off.
Yeah, no, and that's a challenge that I have when I give presentations. It's like I want to explain to people sort of like how do things work, but I'm not asking the marketer to be able to make vectors and even understand how to encode vectors. But I'm fascinated by the fact that
Yeah.
now with OpenAI, there's an API which is very easy to use that will turn your words into vectors. But like for the most
100%.
part, I think. Go ahead,
No, no,
Jason.
no. I think we have the same problem. But my team are bullying, gently bullying. We at Calicube we call it gently bullying, which is to insist on something with somebody that you know they need to do, and you keep pushing gently until they actually get there. And they're gently bullying me to stop explaining all the geeky details when I'm talking to a marketing audience, and just say Google understands the world. It's up to you to educate it about your corridor. And everyone goes, right, okay, got that, and not to dive into the geekiness. And so it really is. I think it's hugely interesting, and I love what you just explained. But in a marketing
Hey, but
world, are we not confusing things?
I get it. And so I think my audience, and hey, put it in the comments if you disagree, but I think you guys are all a little bit on the geekier side. So you love hearing about
Oh,
this stuff.
right.
But yeah, Jason, I'll be on your show and I'll tone it down. I won't go into any math for that one.
Thank you.
I mean, it was Stephen Hawking who said, like, the moment you add a single equation to a presentation, you lose half of your audience.
Yep.
So by this point, I might have lost 90% of my audience here.
No, no, no. And the thing is, I don't know what your audience consists of. I mean, I didn't ask at the beginning, which was a huge mistake. I'm becoming a marketer, more and more of a marketer, and I insist on marketing and branding and less on SEO. And I love understanding it. I love doing it. We're training a version of GPT-4 called Calibot on 2 million words of things I've said or written. And the engineer who's doing it, Damri, is doing all the vectorial stuff, and he's explaining it to me, and I think it's great. But I never explain it to anybody outside of the company because it doesn't matter. And
Yeah.
the other thing you said, I'd like to kind of rewind a little bit, is you were saying ChatGPT came out, and it really changed everything this year. This was a revolution. We've been evolution for years and years and years, and I think a lot of people are thinking, when's it going to stop? This is a roller coaster, and I want to get off because it's too much. And I was speaking to Fabrice Canel from Bing, who built BingBot. He's been at Bing since the very beginning. So he started the first version. He's still there. He's a French guy. And what was interesting, he said, well, this year you're going to see pretty much everything we've got, because the engineers can now simply push what they currently have, but they don't have the technology to take it a huge step forwards again. So we're going to see different iterations come over the next years. And the next huge change is going to be when quantum computing becomes a reality. And that's another 8 years down the line. So what he's saying is we've got a very steep slope of change that's scaring everybody. But then we're going to have a plateau that gently goes up with AI. And then quantum computing will hit. And then we've got another huge thing to deal
And that
with.
makes sense. But I think if you equate it to so I talk about the three waves of revolution that have come out of the Silicon Valley at 30-year intervals. And the first one was in the 1960s. It was the microprocessor. And that basically made the marginal cost of computing approach zero. And then 30 years later, in 1990, you get the internet. And that makes the marginal cost of distribution approach zero.
Ooh.
And now in the 2020s, again, 30 years later, we're talking about Gen AI, generative AI, and how that's going to make the marginal cost of creation effectively become zero. And most people look at it now as like it's text creation. Image creation is like so. Video creation is still very limited. But I think that's where we're going to continue on this slope, where that foundation is now there. The ability to actually do these things is going to slowly improve, and we don't need another quantum leap until quantum computing, like you said, but we don't necessarily need that quantum leap to do like an amazing array of things with what we've been given in this past year, right? And I think a lot of us are still figuring out, like, how do we do this? And I love that you guys are building your own version of GPT by, I'm sure, fine-tuning and providing in context learning and all of these things. And now there's GPTs that OpenAI has just introduced. So it's really easy for anyone to make their own version of GPT. And I love everything that people are going to be able to do. And I can't wait to see what that means for all of us in marketing, but also so many other industries.
Yeah, I really like the way you analyze that with the 30-year iterations. And the thing is, because the communication has become so incredibly simple with the internet, we're much more aware of this huge change than we were before. And I also think a lot of us are looking at the world and thinking everybody's doing this and I'm not, and I'm suddenly feeling terribly left behind. But I think in reality, a lot of companies and a lot of people are not implementing very much of this stuff. So we're talking amongst ourselves in the geeky world where people are trying these things out. So you have the impression that everybody's doing it. But somebody mentioned to me, Germany is a great example of a hugely industrial country that's barely got itself online for some of the huge corporations in Germany. So they're still back in 1990.
Yeah.
I think we have to remember that the whole world isn't in our little cocoon of geekydom and AI and GPT and so on and so forth.
Exactly. And that's where I'm super excited to live in the Silicon Valley and like have the self-driving cars outside my door every day. And like basically the people building Gen AI, they all live here. I was talking to someone last week, and one of the other next steps that Microsoft and OpenAI really need to achieve to get to that next level is they need the biggest power plant that's ever been built, because the amount of electricity you need to build that next model, GPT-5, is just mind-boggling. And it puts Bitcoin mining to shame. And I'm actually happy, like, needing more power, not a great thing, but at least generative AI seems more useful to me than all of the Bitcoin mining that's been happening. So, like, sure, if we have to invest power, let's do it there. But yeah, I find this fascinating, and I think you make a really good point, right? Like the average person doesn't think about this deeply, doesn't think they use it, but in many ways they probably do use it. I mean, listen, almost every piece of software I use nowadays has some sort of AI built in that was added in the last 6 months. Now, how much of that is smoke and mirrors? How much is that real useful? That can always be debated. But at least there's a trend. Like, I don't need to learn AI. I don't need to. And I personally, I do. I want to build this stuff. I like building this stuff. But if I was the average marketer, I'd be like, yeah, great. I use Calicube. I use Optimizer. These things have AI built in. Like, that's for Jason and Fred to figure out.
Yes.
Right. Yes. I'm going to stay on the cutting edge of the curve by just using cutting edge software. That's all I need to do. But then there's also the thing, like, now you as an agency, you talk to your clients, like, can you communicate what is Optimizer doing in terms of generative AI that helps your customer be on that cutting edge? Because if you can't communicate that, you might still lose that business, even though you're doing amazing things. Again, that goes to, I think, what we started the story with, which is, what is your brand? What do you stand for? And how do you communicate that out? So I think maybe we put a bow on it right here. I think it has been an amazing episode. But any final thoughts from you, Jason?
I thought that was a perfect full cycle, putting a bow on it. Beautifully said. That was most delightful. I enjoyed it greatly.
Yeah, it was a pleasure talking to you, Jason. And so if people want to get a hold of you, what's the best way to do so?
Google my name, Jason Barnard, JASON BARNARD.
Well, you know, the man who knows how to brand search on Google. If you can't find him through a Google search, then he's not worth finding. But he is worth finding, so look him up. Jason Barnard. Hey, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thanks so much for joining the show. Everyone who is watching, if you enjoyed this, make sure you use the subscribe button at the bottom. Make sure you get all of these future episodes and use the comments to let us know what we should talk more about. Or if you have any questions, we'll be happy to respond. Thanks for watching. See you next time.
Thanks a lot.